Cool. So just to briefly show how we got that scrolling behavior, and we'll revisit the blog again and actually show off that lemonade an example. I'm showing off my editor here. Hopefully that's fairly legible. I'll zoom in a bit more. Um, so again, yeah, this is a Next.js application, which is kind of a nice framework and tooling for building websites and web applications, and it uses React under the hood. And because of that, we're using the React runtime here. But a lot of the concepts that I'm about to show can be used with the plain.js plain.js web runtime. Um, and yeah, so similar concepts here. But just to kind of give a brief overview for those of you maybe not familiar with what the React runtime looks like for setting up, I've got this component called scrolling Rive, which is going to be that um, vertical plant growing or the lemonade growing on the side of the page. I'm using some tools from our React runtime. This is a use Rive hook, and I'm passing it in some parameters. You would do the same with the web runtime. It's the name of the Rive file that we're wanting to load in, the state machine, some layout parameters, and whether or not I want it to autoplay. And then I get this Rive instance here. I'm also getting a reference into the state machine input, that scroll PCT input that you saw in Laura and Michael's state machine in the editor. You'll see I'm trying to grab a reference to that and set its initial value to 0. And then at the bottom here is where I actually render the canvas on the page, this Rive component. This is JSX syntax that it looks very similar to HTML, but this is what actually puts the thing on the page. And I have it, I'm using this really interesting technology. I never worked with it before. It's called Tailwind CSS. It's super fun. I had a lot of fun using it these past few weeks trying to figure out this blog. And it's basically just a bunch of utility CSS classes to build your CSS and styles for you without having to actually write any CSS. But I won't digress and go too much into that. That's just this fancy syntax that you see here. But really the meat and potatoes of what I want to go over is this useEffect function. You don't have to worry about what useEffect does, but this starting on line 31 is really what we want to go after. So the way I kind of achieve the scrolling effect is I'm grabbing a reference to the body element of the page, which is going to be the entire body. And actually, let me share my whole desktop because I think it'll be easier. Sweet. Okay. So I'm grabbing a reference to the body of the page, and the body element is basically the element that goes from here all the way down to the bottom of the page. So really the encompassing website. And I'm just trying to get the scroll height in pixels. So the height in pixels from all the way up here, all the way to down here is what I want. Let's imagine for now, for easy math, let's say that's 1,000 pixels. It is way more than that, but for now, we'll just say it's 1,000. And I basically want to see, hey, how much have we scrolled down the page on that body element? And from that, I want to get that in pixels. So then you can see I can kind of get a percentage, like based on the amount of pixels of the height of the page and the amount of pixels scrolled on the page, I can get a percentage like, okay, about 25% of the page was scrolled. And so I have this event listener on the website. This is a web API to essentially listen to whenever there's a scroll event happening. And so every time I scroll up and down, this thing is triggering this scroll callback function. And in this function, what I'm doing is getting the scroll top. And this is that part where I mentioned like, hey, how much of the body element have I scrolled? So say I scrolled about to 50% here. And imagine again, the entire height of the page is about 1,000 pixels. This will give me about 500 pixels in this value. And so from here, this is where I kind of do just a bit of math to try and calculate, okay, well, given 500 pixels and there's 1,000 pixels height on the page. That's about 50%. So I'm going to try and get that into a numerical value of 50. And so you can kind of see from here where I plug that value in. I'm using that number input that I have a reference to in the state machine and plugging that value into that number input. And because the values in Laura and Michael's state machines go from 0 to 100, I can pretty easily correlate that value percentage of how much was scrolled to that number input in the state machine. And so that is really what's determining that blend state, changing the number input continuously here. Um, and it's pretty smooth because that callback is happening every time I scroll. It may not be the most efficient, but because this thing will actually run several times. But that's really what makes it smooth here, and you can achieve this effect. And I'm making the Rive canvas actually takes up about a fourth of the height of the viewport and is a fixed element. And so, for those of you maybe not super familiar with CSS, that just means no matter how far I scroll, this element is always going to be on the page, and it takes up the entire height and about a 1/4 here. So that's just some CSS I'm doing here to always make sure that the Rive canvas is consistently on the page, and you can achieve this kind of effect here. We were definitely inspired by another company that used Rive in a similar fashion. Not exactly the same way, but it was pixelpoint.io. If you haven't checked it out, definitely do so. They have a really cool scrolling animation where it shows some shapes falling and stuff like that. Um, but yeah, and so I also want to show real quickly. Obviously, this was Laura's plant example that we went over, but like Michael mentioned, because it has his example with the lemonade has the same state machine name and the same state machine input. And it also kind of functions in the same way where it's a 0 to 100 range. I can just change a reference from Laura's Rive file to Michael's scroll.rive. Um, cool. And so if I scroll down here, you'll see Michael's example starting to take place here with the lemonade making. Scrolling in that sugar and then the straw. And then scrolling back up, it reverses all of that. So uh, again, if you have multiple kind of design iterations that you want to try, as long as state machine names and inputs are the same and kind of function in a similar way, then it's really easy to swap out different assets here. As you saw, I just kind of changed one line. So yeah, that's how we achieved the scrolling effect. And again, if you're using the web runtime, it's really just this small bit of code to calculate how much of the page you've scrolled. You can use that to set a number input on with a web runtime. So yeah, feel free to check out their Rive files. They're both in the community. You can remix them and try it out with your own design ideas and achieve something similar. Also, the code for this is in the description box below. It's open sourced. You can fork the project if you want to tinker with it. It's based on a template blog starter app from Vercel, and it's deployed to on Vercel platform as well.